Kyle Whitaker is a PhD in philosophy and co-host of A Pastor and a Philosopher Walk Into a Bar. Today, we're talking about what it means to be a Christian materialist. Kyle opens up about how he sits in faith, balancing science and religion, and more importantly, how he found a way to be comfortable in that uncertainty. If you've been wrestling with both, this episode is for you. Welcome. I'm Chris Jones. This is Spiritual Hot Sauce. Kyle, welcome back to the sauce.
Hey, Chris. Good to see you.
It's good to see you. All right, so the last time you were on here, you shared a lot as an academic who still holds to Christianity, and that spoke to people. A lot of people feel like they have to pick. Either I take science seriously or I keep my faith. I can't have both. And that's not true, and that's why you're on here again. You live honestly in that space between science and faith without forcing them together while respecting both. You identify as a Christian materialist. So I wanted to open that up. The last time you said that humans aren't like a trichotomy or dichotomy or have a soul, but they're rather millions of parts, like from biology or neuroscience. But yet you still leave room for God.
Mm-hmm.
Walk us through how you sit in that space of uncertainty.
Yeah, space of uncertainty. Well, let me start there. So there is no such thing as a space of certainty. So maybe we could unpack that if you want. There's no other way to sit. whatever your convictions happen to be, atheistic, theistic, agnostic, whatever. It's uncertain all the way down.
Okay.
I've become comfortable with that. I was convinced that I was wrong about some stuff when I had time to think about it. And so I changed my mind about those things. And I became comfortable sitting in a place of uncertainty with respect to God. I was convinced of a certain kind of approach to the big questions of, the sorts of things that kept those of us up at night who were a certain kind of zealous evangelical who were trying to figure out everything about God and the world and what was actually true with respect to religion and what we should do about it and how we could convince other people to believe like we did, I got to a place with those questions where I convinced myself at least that most of those things could not be known and that the level of confidence I could have about any of them was pretty low. Now, that's not to say that I don't still have beliefs about those things. I do. But I'm not super confident about any of them anymore. And I came to a place where I feel okay about that, right? And I have to kind of move on with my life.
Right.
And so that's what I've done. And yeah, that left me in a place where if you want to put a label on it, you could call me a Christian materialist. That's fine. There's probably other labels that I'd be happy owning. I'm okay owning the label agnostic about certain kinds of things, but I'm also okay owning the label Christian, or even more specifically, specific kinds of Christian if you want. Like I sometimes still refer to myself as a Pentecostal, which would be weird for a lot of Pentecostals, given the other things I believe. But yeah, I'm happy to unpack as many of those things as you like, Chris. Let's dive in.
Yeah, let's go through, because I really like what you said, that you got comfortable with the uncertainty.
Yeah.
And I think that is where most of us struggle. So how did you get to a place where you could be comfortable not knowing?
I don't even know if it was ever conscious. I've had several sort of like realization moments where I had occasion to think about a thing that I used to care a lot about or believe pretty hard and realized that I no longer did either believe it or care about it as much. And then had to reflect on when did that happen, right? So for example, I could point to several examples, but I'll just grab one out of the ether. I used to think it was really important to be a Trinitarian, to think that, God is three persons, one ousia, and that's what defined Christianity, that if you were going to be on the inside, if you were going to really call yourself a Christian, that was one of the sort of core essential things that you had to accept. And that was even part of the process, believe it or not, of evolving to a sort of a more expansive and open faith, because I was trying to sort of get away from everything in Christianity is equally important. And there are peripheral things that you can differ on with respect, who is your brother and sister in Christ? How do you know who's still in the tent with you? let's maybe make the peripheral things less important, and let's really focus on the sort of things in the center that we've all been historically agreed on. At least I thought so at the time. And for me, one of the ways of like expanding and being more inclusive in my definition of Christianity was emphasizing the things at the center. And I put like Trinitarianism in there, you know?
Okay.
And then I went to grad school and I met a lot of really smart people and had conversations with them for a period of years about various things. Some of those conversations were about Trinitarianism, most of them were not. One really good friend of mine I had some arguments about Trinitarianism with. He was not a Trinitarian, still a Christian though. And so that had an impact on me, but it wasn't those arguments that convinced me that Trinitarianism was unimportant. It was what I think it was. This is me sort of psychoanalyzing myself.
Okay.
I came to a point where I sort of realized, I don't know what occasioned it, but realized that that particular belief was no longer important to me, and that people who disagreed with me about that, that I didn't think I had any standing to say that they were any less Christian than I was, or that their beliefs were any more unreasonable than mine were, you know? And I don't think, again, I don't think that it was specific arguments or like discoveries of new evidence about Trinitarianism. Here's what I think it was. I think that the process of being in graduate school
Yeah.
gave me a level of, it gave me two things. It gave me an ability to be more sophisticated and critical in the standards for beliefs that I was willing to accept,
Okay.
and also, you know, ways to assess evidence. And then simultaneously, it gave me an awareness of how many legitimately reasonable and sophisticated options there are with respect to any question like that. And those two things together simultaneously, I think, increased what I would require, what I would demand in order to form a new belief about something, and
Mm.
also decreased the level of importance I put on the beliefs that I hold about any of those things. So it's something that happened sort of pervasively to my reasoning capacity. And then that got applied kind of universally, so that when I then had occasion to consider something that I hadn't thought about in a long time, like, for example, Trinitarian belief, I realized that one, the arguments I used to accept as decisive were no longer decisive to me because my standards were higher. And two, I don't care about that as much anymore because I now recognize how many other potentially reasonable options there are with respect to that, and how, you know, how plural really people's experience of questions like that
Yeah.
can be.
So would it be fair to say that part of getting comfortable in that is realizing focus on what you can control and the things that you'll never have an answer for? It's okay. Just accept what you can?
Yeah, and you know, when you say it like that, it sounds a little bit therapeutic, I guess. I'm not sure of a better word there. And I didn't think of it in those terms, right?
Okay.
Because I was not attempting to do any kind of like introspective work. It's just it's just a change in the way I thought, and
Okay.
then a realization about what that did to the things that I believed. And then if I was going to maintain a faith, it would have to be a different kind of faith, right? It would have to not be defined by the focus on those sorts of things in the way that it had previously been. But I didn't ever find that this made faith more difficult for me.
Okay.
That has not been my experience.
But I guess that's what faith is, though. Accepting things that we don't have evidence for, but yet is
Well, I
a
don't think
conviction.
that.
No?
No, well, it depends on. I want to be more precise about this.
Be precise for me. Unwrap that.
Yeah, so we could spend a long time talking about faith, guys. Uh, there are many ways, as you might expect me to say about anything theological at this point. There are many ways to understand this, and many reasonable directions from which one might approach the question of what is faith. Faith, as I think, as it's used in the New Testament context, has more to do, and there's some translational issues here that I won't go into. Some, you know, history of the concept. To me, it has more to do with, if you want to think of like what is a modern notion that most people would be able to immediately recognize as an analogy for what, you know, Christian faith as presented in the New Testament might be like. Belief is a really bad analogy, and trust is a better one. So faith as trust is a thing that, you know, you'll hear certain kinds of progressive pastors talking about. There's good reason for that. The problem is most of us anyway, in certain kinds of fundamentalist traditions for sure, have been brought up with the notion of faith as belief. And I don't think that is a good way to think about it, either conceptually, theologically, or as like a translation of the words that are actually in the Greek New Testament. So there's that. Faith, as it's presented in that text, I do not think has much to do with your cognitive state at any given moment. But that is not to say that faith is like believing against the evidence, or even acting against the evidence. It's not like being irrational or something like that, right? As a lot of the new atheists from like the early 2000s wanted to say, faith is believing what you know ain't so. It's not that at all. The way I like to think about it, there's a philosopher named William James, who was a very influential American philosopher, 20th century, who had this idea that you could come to a kind of evidential equilibrium about a question. And what that means is cognitively, just thinking of what is rational to believe, what do I have evidence for, you're at a state where it's indecisive. So your evidence for it, your evidence against it is equivalent. It's sort of a wash. So the facts on the ground and the evidence that you possess do not tell you what you should believe or do about X, whatever X happens to be. And but also you can be in a situation where you have to make a decision about X. It's forced on you for some reason, and it's important to you, right? This happens a lot in human life. There's something we have to do, and the evidence on the ground does not tell us which thing we should do, ought to do, right? That is the space where faith is possible, where faith becomes a rationally acceptable, I should say, an important stance. And I think all humans are at least occasionally in that position, in that stance. They take that stance towards things. It doesn't have to just be religious. You can have faith in a lot of different contexts, but it is primarily associated with religious belief for obvious reasons. So, from my perspective, I don't have sufficient evidence about any particular theological question to say argument and evidence and reason point me toward this conclusion. I really used to think they did. I no longer think that.
Okay.
So, a stance of faith is to say the evidence is indecisive, but I still have to make a choice. I have to live in a certain way, and I have to accord my ethical choices with a certain perspective on the world. And that perspective involves, beliefs about God and meaningfulness and what is a good life and lots of other stuff. And my choice to take a stance is a faith choice. It's a choice to trust that certain things are true in a way that I can't justify, and I'm going to act on that. That to me is faith.
So the last time you told me you had some powerful experiences that even when I try to give you a door to get out of, where I said it could have been an emotional thing where people are gathered together, it could be different things, and you said, no, this was God. I mean, I was like, wow, he was definitive here.
Let me make that, though, consistent with what I just said, because it might sound like it's not consistent. It is totally possible that that you could reduce those experiences to some kind of psychological state. There are many ways that you could explain that externally. If you're a scientist thinking,
well, that's how I took that. I took that as exactly what you said, that you in that place said, no, this is how I'm choosing to believe. It was God.
Yeah. And that's a fair example of what I mean by faith. My acceptance of how I experienced it.
Yeah.
How it appeared for me, how it showed up for me, what like that, I had the experience. And my acceptance of that as being what it seemed to me to be is, I think, a faith stance. I'm making the choice to interpret it that way. I think I could choose to interpret it differently, but even that's a little tricky because I would have to like talk myself into it. It's actually very difficult to choose to believe a thing. I don't know if you've ever tried to do that, right? Like, first of all, your evidence has to be indecisive. It has to seem indecisive to you to even have the possibility of doing that. But like, if everything in your emotional life and your context and your social circumstances are disposing you towards one kind of conclusion there, it's very difficult to choose to believe against that stuff. I don't want to say it's impossible, but it's hard. And I think you need to be motivated to do so. And I'm just not motivated to believe, for example, that was like the power of suggestion or something, that those experiences I had were fully reducible to some kind of accidental brain state that had nothing to do with reality beyond what's going on in my head.
Are you comfortable with sharing those experiences with us?
Yeah, there's nothing honestly dramatic or weird about them. One that comes to mind is And some of these happened in like church worship services. Some of them happened when I was having, private devotional time, which I used to do.
Mhm.
Most of them happened in college. Maybe 2 happened in grad school. I'm not certain of that number, but not many.
Yeah.
And then since then, none. But to be fair, I haven't like been actively seeking those kinds of experiences for a long time. The ones that stand out most to me are the ones I wasn't seeking when it felt more like a thing happened to me, like unannounced. God's presence was there.
Describe that for us.
Yeah. So one time I was with a friend in his apartment and we were shooting the shit about, I don't even remember what. And he had to go, he got up and left to go get something out of his car. I don't remember. He left. And so I was like, all right, pulled out a thing and started reading it. And unannounced, unanticipated, it felt to me as though, this is going to sound weird, but it felt to me as though Jesus was physically next to me. And I was overwhelmed with a sense of peace and kindness. The times I've experienced God most powerfully, it's been a kind of sense of kindness and joy, happiness, like the sort of, I don't know, the sort of happiness that you experience with a good friend when you really kind of contemplate how much you care for them and how much they care for you, and you just feel loved. Again, nothing profound or unusual about this, but it was so powerful that I went to his bathroom and laid on the floor and cried for about 10 minutes.
Oh, wow.
And he came in and was wondering what was wrong with me.
But you don't seem like that kind of person to me. You don't seem like that guy. You're not
No,
emotional.
I know, I don't, and that is not typical for me. Okay, but that sort of thing has happened a handful of times in my life.
Well, can I ask you this? Because you were talking about that moment of when you get to that buoyant place where the evidence isn't there and you have the option to choose, I guess, from free will, however you want to believe. Do you feel like those moments, though, are what nudged you in a certain direction where you said, no, I'm going to believe?
So that's a hard question because I was already firmly religious when these things happened, and they happened within that context. And it's an interesting question to think. Well, let's say I'd had the beliefs about religion then that I have now. Let's say I was already at that kind of agnostic-y kind of position then. Would I still have had those experiences? And I have no idea how to
Yeah.
answer that, right? Because I was primed in a lot of ways to have an experience like that. And it probably means something that since I have shifted my perspective, I have not had those
Well, do you
experiences.
need those experiences now?
No, but I don't think I ever needed them, right?
Hmm.
But I think you got to be psychologically honest here and say I had them at a time in my life. If you're looking at this totally objectively, and you were saying you believed this at this period of your life, and you believe these things at this other period of your life, if you're going to have a religious experience, where is it going to happen? It happened exactly where you would predict that it would happen. Okay,
Right.
and it hasn't
Right.
happened in the times when you wouldn't. So that's maybe telling, and this is why I think externally it's totally reasonable to conclude that
Yeah.
this guy did not experience God, and I don't expect this to be compelling or have anything to do with what any other people believe. I can only describe it from my own perspective, which is that I had an encounter with God, several of them, and I haven't since then had reason to believe that it was something other than that. And I also fully believe that if I were to change my habits in a certain way, I could probably have another experience like that. I don't think it was, in fact, this is one of the reasons I'm Pentecostal. I don't think that there was anything unusual about that. I don't. I view that sort of thing as sort of normative to the Christian experience, and I think that if I were to, align my behavior in a certain way, I could recreate it, so to speak.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
if you, in this moment, if you sit and think about that, do you miss that experience? Do you miss having those things happen?
That is a great question. Sometimes yes, most of the time I don't think about it, and sometimes no. It's because it's almost like it formed the background of everything I think about God, and so it's like to miss it might suggest that I've lost. I don't even know how to say this. I still believe God is like that, and I still believe that that is kinda in the background of the world, like, the foundation of the world is like that if God is
Yeah.
real? And so, it's not like I think that's not still there and accessible if it is. And so it's almost like here's an analogy. So, our common friend HL
Yeah.
is somebody I love dearly
Absolutely.
and almost never talk to. And
He's that kind of guy you don't have to.
right, like, when I have occasion to think about how little I interact with him, in one sense, it makes me a little sad, And in another sense, it's like, well, shit, I could call him. You know, he's right there.
Right.
I could have a conversation with him. I could go visit him. I could carve out space in my life to do that. And it's my choice, my perpetual, mostly unintentional, but kind of intentional choice to not do that. God is a little bit similar. He's like a friend that I know I could still have that experience with.
That sounds like relationship, though. That sounds like in those moments was an expression of your relationship with God.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? And that I kind of think it's almost growth. We all start in square one, and sometimes we get what we need in those moments to form whatever relationship it's going to be. But we progress and we grow and we move on, and we don't necessarily need those moments anymore, but yet they're still there, and they kind of formed how we perceive God that makes it possible for us to believe. Is that fair, or am I painting you into a corner here?
No, I think that's fair. Yeah. And I expect there will be times, just because I have children, where this is going to be important to to think through again, you know, to
Yeah, so I mean, you're not done in your
yeah.
growth. You're not done. I mean, your life is still moving and evolving, and you're going to grow, and whoever you're going to end up being, and when and where. But that moment you had is so impactful. It's definitely going to play a part in who you are and how you perceive God, and how your
Yeah.
children's going to see God through you, through their father's expression of that.
Yeah, or lack thereof, right? Yeah, and I have to make some choices about that. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay. This takes us into a great place. The last time we talked, you said you no longer prayed, that it felt false, like it really wasn't you at the time, that it's not that it wasn't up for changing again, but at the time, it's just didn't feel honest for you. Are you still
Mhm.
wrestling with that?
No, because I don't think about it.
I love your honesty.
To wrestle with something, you have to, you know, give
That's
it concerted
fair. That's fair.
attention. It's like it's this time of year, every year during Lent, when I think I need to be wrestling with this, and I'm not. I think the way that that will happen eventually is I'll get back into some kind of church context where the structures are there and the sort of social supports are there to provide a space for wrestling with it. And I'm just not currently in that life stage. I want to be, you know, I want to be.
Do you think you're missing something that you didn't have when you were praying? Hey, everybody, it's Chris. We'll get back to the episode in just a minute. But if you're still with me, then you clearly like the flavor of the sauce. So make sure you follow so you don't miss what's coming up. We're starting a new series called Scars That Speak, where guests share real stories of trauma, suffering, and the hope that somehow breaks through it all. These are powerful conversations about finding life where there should be none. So follow. And if you know someone who needs this kind of heat, then share it with them. Thanks for listening.
Yes. Yeah. Very sort of concretely, I'm missing the discipline that prayer brings. And the sort of that's discipline in the sense of, you know, exterior pragmatic discipline, like you carve out space in your schedule for this and you do so
Mm-hmm.
regularly, and it's just training yourself in that way. But also the sort of interior discipline to like structure your thought life in a certain way, and to it's meditative, you know, prayer is meditation in a lot of ways. And so I'm missing both of those forms of discipline. I eventually I see myself landing in some high church tradition where prayer is incorporated into a liturgy that will give me the structure to get back on the wagon, so to
It's
speak.
just not a priority right now. I think you're 100% right, of yourself and structure in your life. I think you're 100% correct. And you brought up your children earlier. So I'm assuming that there's this. Do you feel like that brings a sense of urgency to the table? That you're kind of counting down the
Uh,
time and looking at when do I need to jump in and do this?
a little bit, yeah. They're still pretty young, but, like, you know, every now and then something will happen, and I realize they don't know anything about this thing that has formed such a huge part of my life.
Yeah. Now, the last time we talked about this, I mentioned my Christian atheist friend who said he rejected the resurrection, but he embraced the teachings of Christ, of love,
Yeah.
and that because of that he identified as a Christian atheist. And you said that you would reject that and you would defend the resurrection because Christianity hinged on it, and that was the experience of it. Break that out for me.
Yeah, let me contextualize that. There's a couple ways you could approach a claim like I would defend the importance of the resurrection. I would not defend it in the old apologetic way that I used to care about defending it, where you try to give evidence for its historicity or something like that, or that you have to believe that it's like the belief in that fact. If you can sort of convince yourself that that really happened,
I got
then
you.
that's core to what it means to be a Christian. It's kind of like that Trinitarian thing again, right? That's the thing that we put in the center of our of our concentric circle view of religion, and that's the thing we rest on. And if you're not really that, then you're not really a Christian. I wouldn't defend it in that way anymore. I have no standing to say whether someone who accepts the resurrection or not is a Christian or not, right? That just isn't live to me anymore. But from a very personal perspective, what makes Christianity meaningful to me? What sort of keeps me in it? And how do I make sense of those experiences that I had and alongside everything else that I know about the world? To me, resurrection is very important for that sort of personal, why does this matter kind of lens. And I could put it sort of academically by saying, without that, I can't make sense of suffering at all. But it's more like, I don't mean that in the sense of I can't respond to the arguments about, I mean it for me personally, if I'm ever going to have a cordial, much less a loving relationship with that being I think I encountered, then there has to be something like resurrection. That still doesn't solve it, right? But there has to be something like that, or suffering wins. There's a philosopher named Keith DeRose who we talked to once on our show, who said something like, the problem of suffering, the problem of evil, why is there evil in the world, is a killer argument. And what he meant is, if you don't have some kind of way to respond to it, even if it's just a stance of hopefulness of what a response might look like, then it destroys faith. It's dead. I cannot make sense of any possible approach to responding to that does not involve a continuation of the personhood of individual humans. And I'm a materialist. So the only thing that could mean is some kind of resurrection, as far as I can tell. Because on any other paradigm that I'm aware of, you're no longer that person anymore. I should say any other afterlife paradigm, right? So resurrection, while wildly evidentially underdetermined, which means we have nowhere near enough, like, you know, argumentative evidence to conclude that the rational thing to believe is that a resurrection will eventually happen. Nonetheless, I think the thing that keeps me, or choosing to believe, having faith that such a thing will happen, is that it's the only way to make sense of.
Okay. This is
Uh,
how you reconcile suffering and how God makes sense.
yeah, this is a necessary thing for me to continue being willing to have a conversation with a being who could be responsible for this.
Mm.
It's ethical as much as anything else. It's like, if death is the end, full stop, then there can be no even possibility of, as far as I can tell, justifying any of this. And if there really is a being behind it, then that being is not good. And it's certainly not the being I thought that I encountered, unless that being is also like a master of deception, right? Certainly not the kind of being I would want to have anything to do with.
Well, that, to me, that experience you had now seems much more practical. It
Yeah.
seems like
Yeah.
how
Mhm.
it communicates something to you that you haven't
It's like,
experienced.
you had some really wonderful, loving experiences with someone you considered a dear friend. You kind of lost touch, and then a decade later, you heard some awful, awful things about that person, and you're not sure whether to believe them now. And you're thinking about what what needs to happen in the future for me to maintain the relationship with this person that I thought, given the new information I possess. But it compounded 1,000 times because it's very difficult to get any actual evidence about, what this person thinks or does. So
Yeah, it's like, well, it's how you describe faith. But at the same time, it just really seems like those moments that you had that were so beautiful and honest was so uniquely yours. But it seems like there's a reason behind it, that it would something you could carry with you in your life
mhm.
that keeps you in that place where you can still hold to hope.
Hope, yes, that resurrection is a hope.
Yeah.
It's the hope of the church, always has been. It's
I guess to me, as I'm just going through and hearing this, it just that's how it comes together with me. I'm not trying to force it into a box. It just is kind of unfolding that way to me, where just that seems
yeah,
to be a source that is always gonna be able to give to you hope because it was so unique. I've never had an experience like that, and I don't think I know anybody else that's had an experience like that. That's uniquely
yeah, and
yours.
it's yeah, that's fair, and, you know, probably most of my friends, many of whom are much more religious than me, have not had experiences like that. It's interesting, this may be an aside, but I think it's worth saying, like, I don't in any way think that the fact that I've had an experience like this should give anyone else evidence for anything or make them like more confident about it. If anything, I think it goes the other direction. Like, so this is another thing I sort of changed my perspective on. I used to think that stories like that where and more dramatic stories than that, stories that Pentecostals love to tell each other about things that God did in their lives. I used to think that those were like helpful for building up the faith of other folks,
Yeah,
especially folks who didn't have such experiences. But now I think the opposite. I think that more likely than not, that the fact that some people have them and some people don't, who are otherwise equivalent with respect to their faith
yeah.
dispositions and practices, I think that should probably make you more circumspect about what God is like than like encouraging. I don't think that's an encouraging thing at all.
Well, I think that if you have a unique experience like that, that's plays into your truth of whatever that is, or your hope, and that your hope or your truth, however you want to frame that up, can never be somebody else's. It's always going to be exclusively
Mhm,
yours, and it was just for you.
mhm.
That's why it was given to you.
Maybe.
Well, that's a good way to say
I don't
maybe.
know what any of this means. Yeah. But it's a thing that happened though, right? It's a fact of life that people have experiences like this, and we have to figure out a way to make sense of it regardless.
So, how do people get comfortable using doubt as a tool to reconcile the unknowable? How do we kind of navigate? Because it's internally in ourselves that we have to use doubt. It's usually not the external, but it's how we process internally that gets us to a place where we get to a higher hope for ourselves. So, how do you use doubt like that?
I don't know that doubt is something you use,
Okay.
um, unless you're like Descartes and you're trying to you're trying to like, you know, formulate a rational basis for all thought. But I don't think that's what you mean.
You give yourself permission to even go
Oh,
into that. Because some people, it's difficult to even say, hey, I'm going to use doubt to navigate, negotiate, and figure out who I am.
yeah. This sounds like a question for like a therapist or something, Chris. Like,
You're not that guy.
I
Well, that's
have to
honest, man.
I need to like somehow convince you that I don't know the meaning of any of this. Or like how it happened, that I ended up at a place of relatively
Well,
comfortable
I don't
equilibrium
think
with
it
all
means
this.
that you have the answers, but it's your experience because I think when other people hear that, because you are brilliant, there's no getting around that. And you are an academic, not a theological academic. When they hear you talking about them, it might make them feel better
Mhm.
in how they are trying to navigate.
I really don't think it should. I think, yeah, feeling better is not a way that most people describe hearing me talk.
Okay.
No, like, yeah, I don't know. So, like, how to use doubt or how to make yourself comfortable with doubt or something like that. I don't have any because I never like set out to do that, right? It's just sort of a thing that happened. I think
That's just who you are.
if you examine your life in a certain way and you're honest,
Yeah.
there's gonna be doubt and you're gonna have to learn to live with it. And it's,
Well, I think you just said exactly what needed to be said. You just have to be honest with yourself.
yeah. And you have to be open to arriving in a place that you are currently uncomfortable with. And if you're not, I don't want to sound like I'm judging folks who are not. I think it's remember what I said about William James, where you're in an evidentially equilibrious place. I don't know how to say that. You're in a place where there's not a rational out for you, and you have to make a choice. There's no
Mm.
judgment from a perspective like that of making one choice over another, unless it's dishonest. But if
Mm-mm.
you can make opposed choices equally honestly, I am not going to sit here and say that you've made the wrong one. If you're not in a life situation where you're able to apply the kind of practices of self-examination that I felt were necessary for me. You're a different person. You're living a different life, and I have nothing to say about that, right? And you might, you might be in a situation where it's possible for you to sort of honestly double down on your faith in a way that was not possible for me.
Yeah.
And if that is, as long as that's not doing any harm to yourself or other people, and it can be honest for you in your context, I have no judgment of that whatsoever. So I don't want listeners to think that I'm saying like you just may not have the capacity to get to where I got to, and it's nothing like that at all. It's, if anything, I experienced this as a kind of doom, in the old sense of like, this is the path, given my psychological makeup and my life history and where I find myself and how I approach the world. This is the path I had to follow, and this is where it led me.
Mm.
But people are on different paths, you know. You ought to like that phrase.
Yeah.
With your
I
past
do. I
language.
do. Thank you. Well, we all have community where we come together and we kind of see God in a one-dimensional way. But we all have to go outside the community to figure out how we need to see God.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Is there a place where you can get to personally where science and faith can coexist in harmony internally? Or is this constantly something that you're negotiating and compromising with inside?
Yeah. So I don't feel this tension at all. I I understand why a lot of folks have thought there is a tension between those things. I think they're all the things that would lead one to the conclusion that there's a tension are all mistaken or misguided in some way, in my view. There need not be any tension whatsoever between science and faith. It is, I think, only due to contingent, recent historical, social circumstances that a lot of folks think there is a tension, because earlier periods in history there was not. And then in other periods in history there were, right? So this is clearly a contingent thing, whether or not people think there is this tension or not, because in the history of the relationship between science and faith, different periods have had different levels of that tension that sort of people on the ground took for granted or not. I tried to express my view about this in an episode that we did on science and faith. I forget how long ago it was, but my view is that they sort of each have their spheres. Their I don't know. They play in their own areas. They're both integral to human life at this moment. Like, you're not going to get away from either of them and be sort of.
So I've heard it put like that science is one wing of the bird and religion is the other wing. And if you don't have both, you're not going to have proper flying bird, that you're going to have a problem.
What's
And it's referring to society as the
okay? I was
bird.
going to say, what's the bird in this analogy?
But a healthy society needs both.
That what needs maybe, but it has, like, the facts on the ground are that humans experience both of these things, and even pre-science, there was the sort of rationalist impulse, the intellectualist impulse. Science is a way of making that methodological and concrete and productive in certain pragmatic ways, but that has always been in the human species, right? It's a part of us. It's in our nature, and so is the religious impulse. And again, I think they both have their place. Maybe the bird analogy is a good one. I haven't thought carefully enough about it, but the problem comes, I think, when you try to mix their methods, and we run into all sorts of error in both directions when we try to do that. So I try to keep a healthy distance between them while simultaneously recognizing the equal importance of both.
And this is a good place, because I would say that you are somebody that could probably do this for others, people that are struggling and feel like that they can't do both. Is there something you could say to them to make them a little more comfortable?
Yeah, why
with that?
not? I mean, I would like to have a conversation with such persons. Yeah, what makes you think that you can't? Is it that you're holding on to something tightly in one sphere that makes it difficult for you to see how you could accept something you also want to accept in the other sphere? And if so,
Yeah.
one, why are you holding on so tightly to that thing? What does it mean to you, such that you think if you were to give it up, you'd have to abandon something important to you? And is that really true? Or is it something that you've
Yeah.
inherited from your community or your culture or something else? Examine that would be one step of advice, because I found that all the things that I thought were important, I needed to hold on to in one sphere that made me think it was in tension with something in the other sphere. On examination, it turned out I was mistaken about something, either the facts or the importance of that I was placing on the facts, right? So, for example, if you want an example, I wondered a lot about evolution at one point in my life, and I thought that it was in tension with certain religious convictions that I had. And I was wrong on both of those levels. I was wrong about the facts, but I was also wrong about how intention it was, the connection I thought it had to the things in the other sphere.
Tell us about that. Give some more details.
Yeah, so I thought I'm trying to remember what it was like to be in that place because it's been so long. I thought it was really important that I needed to get to the bottom of that because everybody in my circles had been totally convinced that if evolution were true, then what we think about God can't be, and vice versa. Our trust of the
Mm,
Bible is unfounded. We're wrong about that, and with that goes everything else they thought. And so I thought that too, and I was trying to
yeah,
trying real hard to get to the bottom of it. And it turned out that I was fundamentally mistaken because they were all fundamentally mistaken because how could they not have been? They never tried to study it. They never had any informed people to talk to them about it. They were getting on with their lives like everybody else and accepting what their pastors were telling them. I was mistaken about what evolution was. I just didn't know what it meant. And when I figured out what it meant, part of the urgency went away because it wasn't what I thought. It wasn't as threatening as I thought. But also, when I had occasion to think about, okay, let's assume this is true. In light of that, what does it really mean for these other religious beliefs that I think are important? And it turned out that the connection wasn't as strong as I thought, that God could be every bit as loving and, all the important things that I thought stood or fell with that issue. Like God was attentive to God's creation and that God was like that there was a creation, like God was actually behind the world in some sense. I didn't have to give up any of that
right,
by embracing, the evolutionary view of the world. If anything, it made it richer. It made it, I don't know. And on the one hand, it made it just accord better with the facts. So I didn't have to experience this cognitive dissonance all the time. But if I tried to think about those facts in a theological way, it wasn't any worse at all. If anything, it was more beautiful and less fraught with potential ethical complications. So, and it's worth saying that I was only able to do that because I was in a position of relative privilege, right? I had
yeah,
the resources and the time to process that in a way that a lot of people do not.
right, right.
That's just a fact that I have to be open about. A lot of people are not in a position to be able to go through a process like that. And so for such people, maybe hearing someone who had that privilege and who was able to do that say, the water's fine on the other side. Don't don't be so don't be so worried about this. Maybe
Right.
that'll be a little bit helpful for some folks who don't themselves have the time.
I think it will because that's a lot of turmoil for a lot of
Yeah.
people.
That's a good example of the sort of keeping the methods distinct thing I was talking about, because that whole confusion, I think, was created by blending the methods in
Mm,
a way that you ought not to have. The people who were asking theological questions were trying to do so in scientific ways, and that was a mistake. And the people
yeah,
who cared about the scientific stuff, and some of them were trying to overlay theological meaning on some of that stuff, and that's also a mistake. And so keeping them importantly distinct while equally important and live helps to resolve.
the pulpit should speak from the pulpit, and the podium should speak from the podium. Stay in your lane, and everything's good,
It's at
right?
least we don't have to. There's enough problems in the world. We don't have to invent new ones. And the evolution problem is an invented problem.
Yeah, we're good at that. Take a few minutes and just give some last thoughts to everybody on this subject. And for people who might be wrestling between faith and science, what advice could you give them in this
It's
process?
honestly, it's not important enough to wrestle with. Like objectively, right? It's not. But if it's important to you and it's something that you feel like you need to get to the bottom of, I really don't think you do. But if you do, and I'm saying this to my past self, right? This is not
Yeah,
important enough to spend the amount of hours that I spent in consternation over this issue
yeah.
and an argument with friends and whatever. But if you're the kind of person like I was who has to get to the bottom of it, I could recommend some reading material if you want some things that you could
Mm,
point to, or go listen to the episode that we did on it, where I think we do recommend some stuff. We have a couple episodes on that actually,
yeah.
but
On a pastor and philosopher walk into a bar, obviously.
that's right. I can send you a couple of links if you want to include those where we hash it out a little
Yeah,
bit.
if you want to, I'll post them up there in the episode for people. So, what would you tell parents who have children and teenagers? Because this is something that teens and children are going to be, wrestling with. What could you tell parents that, some advice for them in helping their children with it?
Trust experts to educate your children for you. Don't try to do it yourself unless you are yourself able to assess genuine expertise. And if you're not sure, then you're probably not. So, professional educators are not the boogeyman. They chose that job because they want to educate your children, and they're better at it than you probably are able to be. And they're not trying to for by and large, there are exceptions, obviously, but they're not trying to indoctrinate your kids. The people who are most likely to try to indoctrinate your kids are the ones telling you ought not to listen to the professional experts. Be suspicious of those folks, the ones who are trying to create controversy where none of the actual experts think controversy exists. So we could have a whole separate conversation about following the consensus of relevant experts. But my one, piece of one sentence advice is listen to the folks who know what they're talking about.
Man, I always love talking to you. This is awesome. Tell us about what you got going on and tell us about what's going on with the pastor and philosopher walk into a bar.
Yeah, we've taken sort of a winter hiatus. So if you look at our feed currently, you'll notice we haven't updated it in a while, but we're getting back on the wagon here soon. We have several things in the queue. We've been talking to some interesting people recently. So I'd say in the next month or so, you can start to expect regular episodes again.
Yeah. Pastor and philosopher walk into a bar. It's good stuff. It's good stuff.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. And I brought up to Randy because I just had Randy, your co-host,
Excellent.
on here. Yeah. And
was he a better interview guest than me? You don't have to answer if it makes you uncomfortable. I'm better though, right?
He is more of a protagonist and you are more of an antagonist. I'm just playing. Hey, Kyle, thanks so much, man.
No, you're right.
I will talk to you again soon. And, if people want to get in touch with you, I guess I should mention this. How do they get in touch with you? Because there might be some people who have questions.
Yeah, probably the easiest way is through our show. So just Google a pastor and a philosopher walk into a bar. You'll probably find our contact info there. We have an email address that I think is posted on there and all of our show notes. So that'd be the easiest way to reach me, most likely. And I'm happy to, talk to whoever.
Man, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for joining me here on Spiritual Hot Sauce. I'd love to hear from you. So please reach out with questions, comments, and/or concerns. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and review us. You can follow us on Facebook for updates and information. And if you enjoy the flavor of the sauce, then please share it with others. I would appreciate that. We'll see you next time.